All right, we are just about ready to begin. Close a few doors and flip a few switches. All right. This is a continuation of what we left off with last time. What we are trying to do is we're calling a funnel method of arriving at events or the conditions that produce events. By funnel, we mean we start with the very broad things and then we work our way inward until we get to the nozzle or the tip of the funnel, and that's where we should expect to find events. Now we come to the part that most students of astrology will recognize in terms of locating events. And that is secondary progressions and transits. Now, to review, the progressions are representations of how the moment of birth expands in time. What is implicit in the horoscope at the moment of birth is expressed in waves of time, you might say, relative to the time of birth. Each wave out from the moment is more expanded, but the influences are milder. One might even say that the amplitude of the waves are damped. This is noted in that when a person gets to be of a very old age, the influences of the progressions and transits are not as intense and as clear-cut as they were earlier. And that's not due to just the person becoming more insensitive with age. It is that the influences are damped. The symbolic wave, it's a symbolic wave, is more expanded. And the one that is most commonly used, there are different wave systems that are used, but the most commonly used wave system is that each day, each 24-hour period after birth represents 1 year in progressed time. The planets, for example, at 5 days after birth would indicate the condition 5 years after birth. Obviously, this is clearly symbolic. It has a quality that it has analogy built into it, and that's important. Now, what is important in this, as in everything in astrology, especially dynamic astrology, is that the dynamic horoscope, whether it is progressions or transits or whatever, we're going to study some other methods, the important thing is that it relates back to the natal. The natal is the ground on which everything else is built. Suppose there are 2 planets in the air, and say it's Mars and Jupiter, and say maybe 10 days after birth, Mars and Jupiter combine in the air. There will be an event that comes out of that, but that is an event that is more likely relative to the world. That event would be significant if it aspected something in the natal chart. So what's happening in the heavens, those things are important, but when we're looking to forecast what's going on in a person's life and the likelihood of events, everything has to relate back to the natal, and significance depends upon the geometric interaction between the dynamic chart and the natal chart. Now, in this, as in all things of astrology, the aspects are the most important part of the horoscope. Now, we want to do a little bit more of reviewing. There's going to be a little bit of overlap between this one and the talk previous to this, and between this talk and the talk that is coming. Transits are the positions of the planets in the heavens at the moment, at any moment, relative to the natal horoscope. As with the progressions, the transiting planets aspect planets in the natal chart if there's going to be something happen, or it's going to be an important time. Things that happen in the world, that may be between planets that are out in the heaven, but that is for the world at large. But for the individual, again, they have to relate to the natal chart. I know I'm being repetitive and redundant, but it is important. We know in astrology that redundancy increases the likelihood of something happening. And so we want to make certain that we get the point that everything always refers back to the natal. In fact, when we get to some of the things in next month's talk, we'll see some startling things about that. All right. Aspects are most important, and they're more important than sectors of time, passages of planets through various different times. Now, so conjunctions and oppositions by transiting planets to planets in the natal horoscope are the most important. If you're going to look at transiting sextiles, you may or may not find something. We look at things in terms of relative significance, and the relative significance of sextile is not as great as that of a conjunction or opposition. Now, let's also review basic fundamentals of astrology. There's one thing that I forgot to mention. In general, progressions are things that come from within. Progressions are things from your inner being that make your way out to the surface, into the physical world, and then they're reflected off conditions in the physical world. Transits, on the other hand, are things that are happening out in the world, not just the planets themselves, but what the planets represent. For example, if you have somebody that, like Saturn in your 10th house, being transited in your 10th house, having Saturn path through it, you might be dealing with a petty tyrant or something like that. But in general, progressions work from within out, and transits work from without in. All right, now we go to the basic fundamentals of astrology. I'm trying to be very good with my notes because I have good notes, and I have a tendency to get away from the notes, and when I get away, some of it is good, but some of the good stuff is lost. And this time I want to be very careful about that. All right, some of the basic fundamentals of astrology that apply to astrodynamics. One is that all astrological effects are angular. That is, whether they're physical or spiritual or whatever. If we look at the sun at sunrise versus the sun at noon versus the sun right before sunset or the sun at midnight, we see that the effect, even the physical effect of the sun, depends upon the angle. There have been marvelous experiments that have done with focusing on certain periods of time of the day and the effects of the sunlight on things, or keeping a person from having sunlight for a given time of the day. For example, they took plants, and one set of plants, they deprived it of sunlight between 10 and 11 in the morning every day. And the other set, the plants were just as normal. And for several generations, the planets that were deprived, excuse me, that were deprived of sunlight between 10 and 11 in the morning suffered very, very badly. All right, so we see there are angular relationships. The most important angular relationships are the angular relationships between the planets, whether it is between natal planets or progressed planets or dynamic planets or what's happening out in the heavens. The aspects are the most important part of astrology. And the basic aspects are conjunction, opposition, square, trine, sextile. And that is planets 0 degrees apart, 180 degrees apart, 90 degrees apart, 120 degrees apart, and 60 degrees apart, respectively. These are very special numerical relationships. If you study mathematics, you see that those are called special cases in trigonometry. Now, there are two factors of greatest importance with regard to influence and likelihood of producing events. They are the exactness of the dynamic aspect and the duration of the dynamic aspect. Oh my goodness, I'm going to have to step off camera for a second. I'm sorry, that sort of happens with me. What sometimes happens is I do these talks under intense light so that I can be seen and I don't have somebody to control the light. And when I get under the intense light, I start squinting, and when I start squinting, I start sneezing, and when I start sneezing, I have a runny nose. The embarrassment of it all. So the exactness of the aspect and the duration of the aspect are the two most important factors in aspects in astrology. The more exact an aspect is, the greater the likelihood of an event. And that is most likely when the event will culminate is at the most exact point. But we'll come to that in a little bit. The longer an aspect is active, the greater the effect and the greater the likelihood of an effect. Now, some would add on to that and say that applying aspects, dynamic aspects, are more likely to produce events. I can't say that that is always true from my experience, but it is generally true. not enough to make it to state it as a rule, but something to look into. I think most people anticipate things that are coming on, and very few are late responders. So that this is why applying aspects are more important. Actually, each individual, with regard to events and applying and separating and other factors, astrological factors that are related to events, each individual is different. And if you're going to work with a horoscope, like I'm assuming you're a teacher or a parent or something like that, it is a horoscope that you're going to be dealing with again and again, you get to learn whether somebody is an anticipator or whether somebody has a delayed reaction or something of that nature. I know myself. I am someone who events occur before culmination when things are applying. And that describes my nature. My nature is, let's get this out of the way. In some cases in life, it's gotten me into trouble because I acted preemptively and produced circumstances that were premature, and the best could not come out of the circumstances. And so that's not the best way to go about it. So there are anticipators and delayed reaction people. Now, some of these things you can determine from the horoscope. Like, for example, if somebody has a strong Mars and Uranus, and that is stronger than Saturn and Pluto, say, Saturn and Pluto are delayed planets, and Uranus and Mars are, let's get this out of the way. If Mars and Uranus are strong, that's likely a person who's going to maybe even jump the gun when it comes to events. Now, some claim that you can tell if the majority of aspects in the natal chart are applying rather than separating, that also indicates somebody who's an anticipator. I can't say that. I don't know that from experience. It's something that is worthy of a study, and I think it should be done, but it's most likely not going to be done by me because gradually I'm moving away from a lot of active astrology. I still do counseling and consulting, but it becomes less and less. All right. Now we should just about be ready to get back to the business of tapering or funneling, as we're calling it. There are other basics that we could mention, but they're not as significant. And I don't want to clog the flow through the funnel because otherwise the talk becomes choked with aphorisms or things like that. Now, the last time we met, we talked about sectors of life or sectors of time. That is, we looked at time in halves, or life in half, the first half of life versus the second half. And we looked at thirds, first third of life, second third of life, and third third of life. And we said that there were things that came to ripeness in each of those sectors. And we went even so far as to talk about climatorixes, which are 7-year periods, which are built right into our body. But so that's what we did last time. Now, there's something one wants to look at, but those are sectors of life or sectors of time, and they are not causal, or there is not a causal relationship between that and events in life. Now, they're an interpretive importance. Something that happens to you in the first half of life, that same aspect happening in the last half of life is going to have a different interpretation, especially something, an aspect that happens when you're 2 years old versus when you're 76 or something like that. So The interpretation changes, but they're not causal. We did give them planetary flavors. We said that the first half of life was likely lunar and the second half was solar. And we looked into a lot of the things that produce 7-year periods and quarters of life every 20 years. And we looked at those sorts of things. Again, those are for description and not for activation. And clearly what we're trying to get to is activation. We want to be able to know what produces events. And the second half of life does not produce events. Now, all right, all right. Now we're coming to not time sectors or life sectors, we're coming to astrological sectors in astrological time. And we're going to talk about life sectors relative to progressions and transits. All right. In a talk like this, there's really not enough time to look at all of the possibilities. In fact, the way it turns out is that we look at very few possibilities. We try to look at the possibilities that are most signal or that are the best example. And if you have a long time, like if you take a daily time and set aside for maybe a half an hour or 15 minutes to think about something in astrology and learn something general like all of the astrological sectors by houses or signs, you can benefit from that and you become encyclopedic. You become like an authority in yourself. All right, so now what we're going to do is we're going to focus for the progressions mostly on inner planets, and for transits we're going to focus mostly on outer planets. And the scale of time is the obvious reason. For example, the sun, which is where we look at what we use for looking at most progressions, in 90 years will have progressed 90 degrees from its natal position. While in that whole period of time, Pluto will have by progression only gone just a few minutes. So usually it doesn't pay to look at the outer planets with regard to progressions. Only in rare cases, and they are rare cases that have significance to them, do you look at progressions outside of Mars. Now, if we look at the other end of it, the Pluto transits through a sign in 20 years, but the Sun transits through a sign in 30 days. So if you're going to look at transits of the Sun, you're going to look at things that are changing very rapidly, and they're changing so rapidly that the duration of applied influence is likely to be so small that you could miss it. There is an exception to this, and that exception we'll come to later. All right, let's look at a few things about major astrological sectors and secondary progressions. Obviously, the astrological sectors that are the most important are signs and houses. The signs are 30 degrees in length, and the average house is 30 degrees. That's by definition. The houses may vary greatly. I've seen houses that have been 65 degrees for people born fairly near the Arctic Circle. Now, I'm going to do something that you would not do in practice. And that is when we're talking about progressions through astrological sectors, I'm going to lump the Sun, Venus, and Mercury together as one. Actually, each of them has their own sectors of progression, but because the Mercury and Venus are so close to the Sun and we're dealing with overall all time, things average out. And so it's legal to do that as long as when you're in practice, if you're wanting to do a sector analysis of the inner planets, you do one for each of the planets. So we're going to do it for the Sun, and we say it's with Venus and Mercury also. In mentioning this, it's important to say from the get-go that it's my experience, and I've not talked to any astrologer that would contradict my experience at all, and that is that progressions of the Sun are usually much more significant than the progressions of Venus and Mercury. The importance of the progressions of Venus and Mercury depend on how strong they are in a horoscope. Like I have an enormously strong Mercury in my horoscope, which is I'm talking all the time. So the Mercury progressions are stronger than normal, but they're not as strong as the progressions of the Sun. I have found that progressions of Mars are stronger usually than the progressions of Mercury and Venus. Now, the Sun and its attendants, Venus and Mercury, on the average pass through a sign in 30 days by progression. So, signs are fields of attitude, of qualities, of flavors. Thus, during such a passage of time, a 30-year passage, there is going to be a background field of attitude. Now, most people don't focus on these things. A lot of astrologers don't focus on these things, and I think that's a mistake. And a lot of people are not sufficiently sensitive to tune in to one of those 30-year sectors until there is a change. And when there is a change, when the Sun by progression passes from one sign to another, then they note. And sometimes they can look back and see, oh, that's what that all was. So we're trying to do that. We're trying to do that ahead of time. The Sun represents self or ego. So, solar progressions are about self-development, how you see yourself or how you apply yourself or what you do relative to self. When the Sun changes signs, one looks at oneself differently. It's almost like looking, if you make an orange sun and have sheets of colors, and you put the orange sun on the different colors, and it brings different qualities out of the sun, and it brings different qualities out of the field of color. And that's the kind of thing that happens with the Sun changing signs. Self-development changes, the way you look at things changes, and the way you look at the world changes. Now, most people are not born when the Sun, Venus, or Mercury is at the very beginning of a sign. And when we look at a chart, a natal chart, we want to see, especially, we want to look at the first 30 years of life. The first 30 years of life are usually more important in determining the quality of the whole life than the last 60. The reason for that is how your character develops and is unfolded. This is why child rearing is so very important. There is an old statement that goes, and a maxim that says, as the twig is bent, so grows the tree. And what happens in those early stages is very important. Now, if we note where in the sign the sun is located, we get some idea of what the person is going to learn during the developmental years. Now, suppose the sun is born right near the very beginning of the sign. Say it's like 2 degrees of Aries. Now that individual is going to see themselves as somebody dynamic. That's the basic character that has been brought from the past life, and that is going to be expanded in this life. But in the ensuing 28 years before the sun progresses into Taurus, the whole background is going to be like Aries. And this indicates that in terms of time, the background through which the self is developing is like the basic character of the self itself. That means that this is somebody who's going to be a specialist in Aries or in a certain kind of activity. On the other hand, if the Sun, Venus, or Mercury is at the end of a sign, the basic character is one way, but the development is going to be different. Suppose somebody is born at 28 of Aries. At age 2, the Sun is going to progress into Taurus. And that means for the next 30 years, that individual is going to be in a background that is different from their basic character. Now, their destiny has different reasons for things. The recording angels who set up destiny have different reasons for things. And this might be because a person was too much involved with Aries, and though that is their basic character, they need to change, and the development in those 30 years is going to bring about a change in the basic character. Then suppose, for example, somebody's born right in the middle of Aries or any sign. That means at age 15, there's going to be a dramatic change. Now, if we align this up with the climaterixes, we can see that age 15, the person is unfolding the emotional nature, the desire nature, and it's the period of rebellion. And so the basic character, the emotional nature of that person needs to change. That if a person is born in the middle of a sign, there's going to be a radical change during teenage years, and that is important for whatever the development is that they're brought to birth with. I can give you some examples, but obviously there are millions of examples, but all we're trying to do here is present the ideas so that you can tune in with your intuition by looking at these facts or these setups, and then with your intuition you can see what it means. If a parent comes to you and says, my son is awfully sluggish these days. Why is that? He's 15 years old, and he hasn't always been like that. And this indicates that maybe in the individuality the person is in Aries, but when the sun progresses into Taurus, at the same time the emotional nature is developing, the person is kind of sluggish or slowed down or having to deal with limitations of space or materials or something of that nature. So, if somebody's born at the beginning, that's a specialist. If somebody is born at the end, it's a breakdown. And if we look at different places, if it's At age 7, when somebody changes, that means the body is, the basic physical personality was supposed to be one way, but the growth patterns and the vital nature are supposed to be different. All right, I think we've got that idea. This is something, most people don't deal with this at all. And I think that's very sad. If it's lucky if you learn about astrology when you're a young person, because then you can get the most out of your life by understanding these things. But for the most part, you go to an astrologer, the astrologer isn't going to talk about these things. But if you're a parent, this is important to you. Not only the events that come from progressions, but the sectors. Those are important also. This is a very valuable thing. Now, as we've been saying all along, this applies to Venus and Mercury also, though the influence usually isn't strong. Suppose, for example, somebody does have a very strong Venus. So then you're working with the higher emotional nature of the child. And if Venus changes signs somewhere in the teenage years, that's important for helping this person to develop the artistic or their social nature. Those are things ruled by Venus. All right, so you get the idea that there's a different background quality. Or suppose you have a mental prodigy and Mercury is very strong. Looking at where Mercury is in a sign is also highly important. Now, we're only a little bit down the funnel at this point. We left the lip, and we've gotten down to looking at progressed sectors. Now, so far what we've done is we've looked at progressed sectors relative to the signs. We're not going to take a bunch of time and do the same thing for the houses. If somebody is born in the houses with something early in a house, there's something parallel, but it has to do with opportunities rather than qualities of character. If a person is born early in the second house, during their whole childhood, they have a chance to make money with a paper route or babysitting or something like that. And that is important to their future life as far as the opportunity for income or materials or things like that. I have the sun in the second house, and I have it just before the middle of the second house. And so in my teenage years, I had a paper route, but that was one of the most disheartening experiences of my life. I learned as a teenager that you get up at 5 in the morning and you fold the newspapers and you go tooling along on a bicycle or walking along and you throw the newspapers on their porches. Then maybe you get a little bit of sleep before you have to go to school. And then comes at the end of the week, people don't pay you. I quit the paper route very quickly because I ran into so many moochers that wouldn't pay me, and they didn't have any conscience about it. They were basically getting a free paper because the paper boy has to buy his papers, and then he gets the markup for the delivery. And you're even told how much you can mark it up. So that was my second house experience. The same way it is with all of the houses. We talked only about developmental things, but you suppose in the second third of life, suppose that's when you have the sun in the first house, and you're developing your personality, but then the sun progresses maybe at age 20, it progresses into the second house. That's somebody who's going to focus on income for the next likely 30 years. So the basic ideas that we have set down here are ideas that you use them and use your intuition and see how they apply to your chart or your children's chart or your student's chart or sometimes your friends. All right. Now let's turn to transits. We have been looking for the most part only at progressions in astrological sectors. Now the thing of it is that we can hasten our pace because everything that we have done so far applies to the transits. The principles are the same. The means of funneling are analogous. So there are only a few very differences between the transits and the progressions. One of them has already been mentioned, and it's going to be mentioned again and again in these talks, and that is that transits work from without inward, and progressions work from within outward, out into the world. It isn't universally the case, but pretty generally that is always the case. So if we look at it this way, we can see the horoscope as an interface. It's an interface in several ways. For one, it's an interface between one moment, the moment of birth, and some other moment in the future. Whether that other moment in the future is by progression or whether it is by transit, the whole idea is you're looking at one moment of time relative to another moment of time. It's a moment where something has been injected into the stream of time. When you're born, you're injected into the stream of time in the world. And when other events happen, other things in the world affect you. Now, all sorts of things are being interjected at every moment. I don't know how it is. I don't remember the numbers. I should look that up later on. How many people are born every moment in the world? And you think of all those horoscopes, each one being translated, being used in a different way. Then there are the influences of things injected into the time stream from the past. I benefited from that greatly. My father was born at a time that he was to become an orphan. And because he didn't have parents for most of his upbringing, and he had to deal with step-parents that didn't care for him or adoptive parents that didn't treat him well, I benefited from that because he was an excellent father because he gave to us what he never had himself. So those are events from the past that affect us. Now in the whole stream of time, some things are more important than others. Some things that affect the whole world, and they affect the whole world for long periods of time. Suppose there is a cataclysm, huge earthquakes, and the land masses are reshaped. That's something that's going to affect millions of years in the future and the evolutionary activities and opportunities. So what I'm trying to point out is that we're in something that is constantly having new things put into it, but that things from the past have influences on the new things, and while we're having a continuous experience through the world in our lifetimes, like we're affected by the past and the moment and the future. All right. What I'm trying to indicate here is that with the transits, especially more than with the progressions, we are adapting to an astrological environment. And that astrological environment is closely in touch with the physical environment. And the interactions to them are what we work in. And those are our opportunities. It is our opportunity, because we are creators in this. By taking actions in our life and changing conditions, we become creative beings. Now, another way that the horoscope is an interface is, just bringing us right back on topic, it's a junction between the within and the without. In the without, linear time is carefully measured. They have atomic clocks. Right now they're trying, because of the fact that the moon-Earth system is changing and the rotation of the Earth is increasing, I believe it is, that the second has to have a different meaning. And I think the standards for the world for what is a second in relation to atomic clocks, which depend on very regular atomic decay, they're working on that very thing right now. However, everything, though it is precisely measured in time, everything is based on astronomy. The hour, the day, the week, all of those are astrological, astronomical things. The year, one cycle of the sun is a year. So time is a copotential of space. Can't really be separated. Each brings a different quality, and each is different in different ways. Now, though we have precise means of measuring time without, we can measure the rotation of a star millions of years, light years away from us, but we have no measurement for time within. We haven't reached that objectivity. We don't have that precision of consciousness. So what we do is we reflect off of a symbolic time out in the world. And that is what the progressions and the transits are. It's a symbolic way. People have, by observation, people who can see in the inner worlds and judge in time, have set up things like progressions and things of that nature as representing changes that occur from within as one matures and comes into the world. So we have symbols, and symbols are gateways between the without that we know and the within that we don't know. But through a symbol, that symbol, we're drawn to it because it's apt. And by looking at a symbol, we can understand something from within. So that is basically what we're doing when we're talking about progressions. They are symbols that represent changes within relative to things without that reflect the internal changes. We know that the physical body changes over the septenary periods, and we know that reflexes start deteriorating at age 28 and things like that. But with progressions, we can see other things that are happening in the character. And that's what I'm trying to do with these talks, is help people to understand, that we're not just predicting things. Oh, something horrible is going to happen to you at this age, or you're going to go through a down period at this time. You want to help people to understand what it is they're going through and what they can do with it and how they can get the most out of it. And that is the purpose and function of astrology until we can see ourselves inwardly. This is one of the reasons why astrology is important as we get older. As we get older, we know ourselves more inwardly, and we understand how things are developing in us. We can watch and see where our bad attitudes or our good habits or things like that are for our benefit. This is why it is important that one study not merely astrology. One wants to practice inner disciplines. It's important to look back at your day every day and see what you did and what you didn't do. And from that way, you can come to know yourself inwardly. Or practicing concentration. If you practice concentration, you can be in better control of yourself, so that when there is a critical time, you're in control. And something like prayer, because with prayer you can connect to the higher purpose of it all, and it takes you out of too much busy work about daily life. All right. It goes without to say that a person has to be capable of changing things, which most people aren't. And that's why we do spiritual exercises. Now, in changing things in ourselves and in the world, the former being more important than the latter, the things that are harder to change are usually the ones that are most in need of experience. All right. By now we've gotten a long way away from transits, but it's important to take these little epigeses to go into things, because we're not just studying astrology, we're studying life. Without an understanding of an ongoing creation, there's a tendency to be fatalistic, especially when astrology is involved. And there's something very important in this. We want to be participators in life. We do not want to be pawns to be moved around by others, and we don't want to be bystanders while the world is going past us, and we don't want to be commentators. It is important that through astrology that we know in dynamic times that we can contribute. Sometimes the contribution is not acting, but those are little details. Our nature, what we do, is our character. Character is destiny. It's possible to try to become something like a participator, an observer instead of a participator. Take an example. Suppose you go to a party and you're with friends at a party. Often in that party there will be somebody with a camera, and that person will be catching intimate conversations or also, goofy moments or things of that nature. But the person with the camera is not a participator. The person with the camera might get insights, but the person with the camera doesn't celebrate the party through participation the way everybody does. Now, it's very important with astrology that we be participators. Astrology is here for us to take action or to not take action when that is appropriate. It is not to live in a false world of astrology. So, if we do that, if we start thinking of the astrology of the situation and not, astrology is like the camera. Yeah, you get some great insights, but you got to do something with them. And that is very, very important. If you don't do something with them, your life goes by, you know. And the thing that with astrology that is especially dangerous is that if you become the person with the camera, you're aligning yourself with destiny. So that if you start making predictions, you are a destiny being and you're not a participator. And I have worked with astrology for, I think, more than 65 years. And I very much dislike making predictions. I rarely ever make predictions. And if you're clever about it, you can get people to take action or to be careful without having to make a dire prediction, oh, something very bad is going to happen to you, because that doesn't help anything. All right. This is going all over the place where I didn't expect it would, but we're not out of shape. The other major difference between progressions and transits is the scale of time. In general, transiting activities occur much faster. They're further down the funnel. Progressions are fairly near the lip of the funnel, and transits are further down the funnel. This is why we work only with outer planet transits. Inner planets transits are so fast, they're all at the nozzle of the funnel, they're hard to keep track of. There's so many happening so quickly. We're going to talk about that in the next talk. Now, we remember that as the progressed sun passed through one sign, it averaged about 30 years. Now we're talking about transits. Pluto transits through a sign in 21 years. So in that period that the sun is transiting through one sign, progressing through one sign, a sub-period of Pluto being in one sign and then in another sign. So you can see a sub-period which is further down the funnel than before. And right now Pluto is actually moving faster than Neptune. It has a very elongated orbit, and it gets inside of the orbit of Neptune, which I think it is right now. But at any rate, over average, Pluto goes through a sign in 21 years. Neptune goes through a sign in 14 years. Uranus goes through a sign in 7 years. Saturn in just under 2.5 years. And Jupiter goes through a sign in 11 months, or just under 1 year. And Mars transiting goes through a sign in 2 months. So you can see right here a funneling just within the planets that we consider in transits. We can see that there are a lot of sub-periods. So suppose the sun is passing through the sign for a 30-year period, and suppose that the outer planets are transiting at normal. Now the progressions and transits share the same astrological atmosphere. You know, if you're having a progression with the sun progressing through Gemini, that's in your auric atmosphere, your astrological atmosphere, so to speak. And at that same time, from without, the transits are bringing different qualities into that period. It makes things quite variable. And this means that while a person is going through that 30-year period, Mars will have gone around the entire zodiac 15 times. And Jupiter will have gone through 12 signs twice. So there's all kinds of sub-flavors. So the transits are giving sub-flavors, and they're faster and faster as you work inward. Woo! Excuse me, that's going to sound good on the tape. So we can see that in one Jupiter cycle, there will have been many Mars-Jupiter combinations. And this is just to give you an example of what subperiods are like, what it's like when you move down the funnel toward the nozzle. Now, from these things, there are two conclusions that we might be able to draw from the combination of progressions and transits. First is a questionable conclusion. It is that from an astrological perspective, internal changes come more slowly than changes in external conditions, because internal changes come with the progressions and the transits come from external conditions. Now you have to differentiate here. You have to differentiate between real change and fluctuations. You know, butterfly has many fluctuations of its wings, but but the drifting along is something definite. The changes take a longer time, and they're more definite and they're long-lasting. Fluctuations are rapid and short. And as we've just seen with the combinations of cycles, you can have many fluctuations in a short amount of time. Now, if you want to change your nature, your emotional nature, what you basically feel like to others emotionally, in order to change that, it's a long, slow process that you have to work very hard on. At the same time, if you're an emotional person, you can get excited very quickly. You can make all kinds of changes, fluctuations in emotions quite clearly. This is what astrology indicates. You can't prove it as a law of nature. You can't say that this is an astrological tenet that you can't deviate from. But I have found it to be true that the inner changes definitely take longer than responses to outer fluctuations. I found it to be true, and it's satisfying when astrology agrees with what you observe. It's helpful to have astrology suggest things to you to look for. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to make a great discovery, but astrology is a great thing for piquing curiosity, saying, what does that mean? And then using it to have observations, and then from the observations is where you get the facts. So, but to say an observation means that there was an intended result to an astrological condition, that kind of thing is astrologically shady, and I don't think a person should ever do that sort of thing. All right, the other conclusion, we said there were two main conclusions that we could draw from what we just looked at. It's more germane. And this conclusion is that there is more usable tapering in periods when passing from Pluto inward. When we looked at progressions, we noted that with regard to signs and houses, the periods of Sun, Venus, and Mercury were the same. Excuse me. Thank goodness these talks are informal. When we looked at progressions, we noted that with regard to the signs and houses, Sun, Venus, Mercury were roughly the same. Progressions of Mars, compared to the other planets, are on a 1.5 to 3 ratio. That is to say, in a year, in a life of 90 years, the Sun and the inner planets will have gone 90 degrees. In that same sign, at the same time, Mars will have gone 4.5 signs. And the same period, Jupiter will have gone through a quarter of a sign. There's a kind of tapering here also, but it's an inverse tapering, which is when you get to outer planets, periods, we don't even study periods because they're too long, but the progress to outer planets. All right, I'm got to refocus again. We have differentiated between changes in the dynamic horoscope between inner planet progressions and outer planet transits. But nonetheless, both are active at the same time. It's just that the inner planet progressions are subjective and relative to one individual, and not so much the same attitude happening to the whole world at the same time. Now this makes for some interesting combinations between the within and the without. The general principle is, again, that the within is, how to say it, the within is the reference. Let's take an example. Suppose there is a time out in the world when there is a lot of fear and concern, and it's a period of panic. That would come from the transits. But if at the same time the person is a calm person and a reserved person and not easily excited, it may indicate a hard position, but a person isn't going to be deeply affected by it. So this is an example when the without and the within are opposite of each other. But if the without, if there's a period of depression or panic or fear, and the individual is prone to that from within, that's when you have disastrous conditions. Now that is an extreme case, and it is an obvious case, and it is a case that anyone can see. But if you take that principle of the relationship of the within to the without under any condition, whether it is under a sector or whether it is under an aspect time or a period, a shorter period of time, that is that's the same principle works. Obviously, people don't understand that astrology is a lot of work. People think that all you have to do is look at a horoscope and you'll be able to tell what's going to happen. If you could do that, I'm not even sure that would be any good. That would again be being a predictor. But if you understand the forces that are in play from both without and within, you can understand and you can help an individual to do the most that they can with any given situation. All right. We're going to stop abruptly in here somewhere because we're already over an hour. I try to keep these at an hour, but it doesn't always work that. Now, when we looked at progressions, we looked at progression through the sectors. the signs, and the houses. And we use the sun for our example. And that's because solar progressions are usually more significant, and because the sun and the inner planets over a long period of time average out to being very much the same. If we're looking at a short period of time, then it's important to look at the Mercury and Venus and see what they're doing, but that we'll come to that at another time. When we did that, it was obvious that there are differences when you're born at the beginning of a sector, the middle of a sector, or at the end of a sector. And we saw that these same observations were analogously true for transiting planets. Now, along the way, some modification may have to be made, but that's, it isn't all written out what a life is going to be. Even if you have a horoscope that you have a specific life to work with, life is like that. You're going to have to modify the way you approach it all along. To delineate for all of the progressions and transits would be too tedious, and it would become boring. And I'd have to put in all kinds of spicy side trips or something like that to keep it from becoming too boring. It might also be an insult on your intelligence and your intuition. If you observe the fact, and if you observe people's lives, and you're working with somebody, your intuition is as good as my intuition. Intuition is truth, and truth is truth. So I don't want to, I don't want to insult you by doing all of the cases. Now let's go to another level of tapering. We want to go closer toward the spigot. We want to go closer to the spout. And in fact, we'll be closer to the spout than we are to the lip right now. And we're going to do that by looking at progressed and transiting aspects. We're not going to get really far with it tonight. We're just going to lay down the basics, and then we're going to say that's enough, and it'll give you something to think of over the month. We're doing our tapering, our funneling. And we've noticed that there are sectors of time and flavors of attitude, and there are fields of opportunities. And within these sectors, whether they're sectors of time or astrological sectors, events take place. And we've said so far that the astrological sectors are more important in determining events than time sectors, because time sectors don't produce events. Now, we could liken the astrological sectors to seasons. We could say that summer's going to be hot. But within that, we could say there may be a heat wave. And in that heat wave, there would be maybe 3 to 5 very hot days. And within that period of 3 to 5 days, there may be one cooker of a day where it gets up to be 100 degrees Fahrenheit or something like that. Now, when we do that, that's an analogy. The summer is like the major sector. It's like the sign or the house. The 3 to 5 day period is like the period when there's an aspect taking place. And if there is an event within that 3 to 5 day period, that is where the event would take place. So what we're saying basically is that an event is an objectification of the environment in which it is born. An event is an objectification of the season or the environment in which it is born. It is the epitome, or an epitome. When an event occurs, there's no doubt about the general season. There's no doubt about that small field within it which it is born. Events finalize things. It's a matter of surety. And that, in terms of character development, is more important than predicting that something is going to happen. If you have been lackadaisical and not careful, and suddenly an event comes along and you injure yourself because of carelessness, that is a finalization. There may have been times when you could have noticed the carelessness in you and learn your lesson and not have that happen, but the kind of person that is careless in that way is also the kind of person who says, oh, it's all right, nothing's going to happen. But when an event happens, it is undoubtable. It has happened because it was supposed to happen. So an event in that way is definitive. Now, if an event is going to happen, it's almost certain that it's going to happen during a dynamic aspect to a natal planet. Maybe several different planets in different parts of the horoscope might be undergoing some kind of progression. But if there's going to be an event, it's not just going to happen out of the blue. It's going to happen somewhere when there is a dynamic aspect going on. However, not all dynamic aspects produce events. I'll repeat that because that's an important one. Not all dynamic events, aspects or periods produce events. Again, we're saying that we're talking about character building here. Not all processes require events to prove them. Suppose you're working on an attitude and it builds up to a period that's very important. There doesn't have to be an event. You can learn some lessons without an event taking place. In that period, when there is a dynamic aspect taking place, there is heightened consciousness, and the lesson, the air is thick with the lesson. And if you can learn the lesson without having to have an event, so much the better. So, not all real events need, not all things need to be learned. Sometimes you'll go through a period that with a dynamic aspect and you'll get part of an understanding of something, and maybe a few years later another aspect will come up and you'll get more of an understanding of it. But it does not necessarily mean there's going to be an event. Let's take an example. It's not a very pretty example, but it is an appropriate example. Let's take a pimple or a boil. And that's a small, mild, local infection. What happens is, if your body needs cleansing and it needs to get rid of something, normally things are cleansed from the body through the lungs and through the urine and through the GI tract. But sometimes things work their way to the skin and have to be worked out. And that's basically, there's a small little local infection. Now, not every pimple or boil comes to a head. Sometimes one will rise and you'll watch it and it'll be there for a while and then it'll gradually subside. The body will have been able to have taken care of what needed to be taken care of, and then it's over. But sometimes, if things are more drastic, the pimple or the boil comes to a head and you pop it, and then it is expelled without the body having to go through the laborious process of taking something in. That's what a period is like. If there is a progressed or transiting aspect, there may or may not be an event. And it's important to understand the lesson, because if you can understand a lesson, you won't have to have a negative event, or if you're trying to have a positive event where you're trying to accomplish something that you've never accomplished before, you'll know what you have to do and when you have to do it to come to a high point in your consciousness and in your ability to carry something out, and then you'll have your success. Now, if we look at things in this way, the dynamic aspect, whether it's a progression or a transit, is like a miniature. It's a miniature of the larger season. As we've been saying before, summer with a hot heat spell. Now, it's to our advantages, if we are astrologers, to know when these minor seasons are going to occur. That is to say, when will a dynamic aspect be in effect? And the same thing is true in dynamics as in natal astrology, except that the parameters are different. That is to say, when is a natal aspect in effect? And that's something that there's not always agreement between astrologers. But I'll give you some of the basic ideas. Between major planets, Sun, Venus, Mercury, and Jupiter or something like that, for major planets and major aspects, a 6-degree orb works. Sometimes between the Sun and the Moon, only the Sun and the Moon, not with other planets, but just those two, an 8-degree orb applies. Between minor planets and minor aspects, 3 degrees is an orb. For other things like fixed stars or points or parts or something like that, a degree to a degree and a half is a reasonable orb. The people that I know that work with fixed stars usually stay within 1 degree. They don't even go for that extra half. Now, when it comes to dynamic aspects, the orbs are much smaller and it's much tighter. Otherwise, the principles would be the same as the principles for natal orbs. Like if you have a really tight natal orb and you say something about that aspect, you're going to be right because it's obvious. If you have an extremely loose orb, you might be able to draw on some things, but things might be fuzzy and you might be reading your own imagination into it. So there is an appropriate orb. You're always going to be right if you stay with a real narrow orb, but you might miss something. If you have a real big one, you're dealing with fuzziness and perhaps personal interjection into the understanding. And the same thing is true with orbs for progressed and transiting aspects. what I use for major planets is 1.5 degrees. This means that for the sun will apply for 1.5 degrees and then it will leave for 1.5 degrees. And that means a solar progressed aspect will be in effect for about 3 years. I very rarely work with minor planets and minor aspects, but surely you do not want an orb greater than 1 degree. All right, now we have the ground rules ready. We can understand what we're going to try to look to find events and likely times of events within the little subsector that is an aspect, a progressed or transiting aspect. And that's what we're going to start doing next time. And then next time we'll get all the way down the funnel to the nozzle. And I don't know if we're going to, after that, take yet another talk and give some examples of funneling. It's to find it really simple, clear, direct examples is not always easy. So that's it for this evening. Thank you very much. I enjoyed it. I hope that this was reasonably clear. I apologize for my reaction to the lights. Well, it's a less than perfect world. Thank you.